Howdy, welcome back. So we'll move on to passing arguments by reference. And before we begin, remember here, the semantics of argument passing are going to be identical to that of initialization. So what you just saw with respect to binding references to an object in the previous video will hold here when a reference is a parameter to a function. The cool thing with passing arguments by reference is essentially you can have name, a nickname for some object within the scope of a function when that object actually lives back in the caller. So here we go. Reference parameters and function calls. Each time a function is called, its parameters are defined and initialized by the arguments passed to it during that call. And as we keep saying, the semantics of argument passing are identical to that of initialization. So what's going on here? So let's go ahead and just draw this out. So we have main. We see I, whose value is initialized with 4, and then j gets 6. Now we notice a call to our swap function. So let's go ahead and create some space for it. This is swap. Now notice here we have two reference parameters. And how you can think about this is here's I, here's the parameter. What this looks like is int a equals to I. Likewise, this is no different from if we look at, int b, that looks like this. And then we're initializing it with its argument, j. Let me make this look a little peachier. Say that goes to that, just so it's clear. So in this case, when we begin executing this swap, we see A has become another name for I. B has become another name for J. When we get into the execution of the body of this function, we see that temp is going to be a local variable to it. It will take on the value stored in A. Notice this is initialization of a copy. There's no ampersand there to communicate that temp is a reference. So in this case, temp will take on the value of 4. Now we make an assignment to A. A is a reference for I back in main. So when we make the assignment to A, we're really assigning to I. So in this case, I will take on the value of 6. Next up, B takes on the value of temp. B is simply an alias for J who resides back in main. So assigning to J is going to cause the value of, assigning to B is going to cause the value of J to change as well. Then we run off the bottom of this function and we return back to main. Memory is deallocated for our swap function. And you can see here that the values have been successfully swapped at the end of this. So when a parameter is a reference, we say that the argument is passed by reference because the parameter becomes an alias for the actual argument. The reference parameters are names within the scope of our function for the actual arguments that are residing outside of it. I have a comment here that goes, why is lifetime important? You will know the answer to that question as soon as we cover functions and the stack, which we will do immediately prior to dynamic memory. But what we will see is essentially that during a function call, the previous function call's memory is still allocated, and memory is only deallocated when we return from that function. That's why we're able to access the variables in the caller when they're passed to the callee by reference. Consequently, because of this, changes that the function make on reference parameters will always always be reflected in the object bound to that reference, just as we showed right here. And again, do not overcomplicate this. I know the ampersand looks like it looks intimidating, but all we're saying is A is a reference to an integer object. Which object? Well, when the function gets called, it's going to be bound to, in this case, I. A becomes another name for I. That's all it is. Any interaction with A is really interacting with I. And the same for B and J. So that's a brief introduction to pass by reference. We're now going to move into when do we pass arguments by reference, and also introduce the idea of passing by reference to const, which is also kind of an interesting take on all of this. So with that ado, we'll be right back.